The multi-store model of memory is an early model describing human memory, but it's still fairly influential in our understanding of how the memory system might be organized. So according to the multi-store model of memory, memory can be divided up into different stages that differ in terms of how long they retain information. The first stage that information reaches when it enters the system are the sensory stores, and the sensory stores are stores that retain information for a very brief period of time, depending on which sensory modality they belong to, so either visual or auditory or tactile information, for example. Information that is attended in the sensory stores may be transferred to the short-term memory store. The short-term memory store retains information for a brief period of time as well, but much longer than the sensory store, 20 seconds in the multi-store model of memory. And if information is rehearsed sufficiently within the short-term store, it may be transferred into the long-term system. And from each of these stores, information may also be lost. In the sensory store, information is lost simply through decay. So the sensory store has a default setting of being empty, and information simply stays in there for just a few seconds and then is lost automatically. From the short-term store, information is lost also through decay. So the short-term store also has a default setting of being empty, but also through displacement. So the short-term store has a limited capacity, and once we exceed that capacity, any new information may displace information that's already in there. Sometimes it might be difficult to retrieve information from the long-term store because of interference, and we'll look at all these different principles in a bit more detail in a second. So just in short, these are the three systems of the multimodal model of memory. So the sensory stores are modality specific and keep information for a very brief period of time. We have an iconic store that deals with visual information, an echoic store that deals with auditory information. So the evidence for the idea that we have a very brief duration iconic memory came from experiments done by George Sperling in the 1960s when he reported the so-called partial report effect, which was a finding that if you presented people with a display of let's say 12 letters, this is too much information to remember in one sweep. So if I show this to you briefly and then take it away, you won't remember all those letters, but you will on average remember about 4 of them. Now what Sperling did was add a manipulation to this display, which is that after the display is taken off the screen, he presented a tone that could either be high, medium or low, or on some trials there was no tone. And the tone indicated which letters had to be reported. So if the tone was high, participants had to report the top row here, medium for the middle row, and low for the bottom row. And you don't need to use tones, you could do it with colors. For example, red, go for the top, amber, go for the middle, and green, go for the lowest row. The key finding was that compared to the baseline condition, in which there was no cue after offset of the display, people could remember a lot more when their attention was cued to one of those three parts of the input. So although in each trial they would only be reporting 4 letters, either those 4, those 4, those 4, or any 4, given that people didn't know by the time the display was taken away from view what the cue was going to be, the fact that they could report either those 4 letters or those ones had to suggest that for a brief period of time they had access to the full display, even though it was taken away from view. So here's the data from the partial report effect. So first let's look at the full report condition. So that's the baseline condition where people are asked to report any 4 letters, and regardless of the number of letters in the display, so even when you go up to 12, the condition we just saw, people report 4 items. But in the partial report condition, when you're asked to report a certain 4 letters, people's performance was near perfect. So that suggested that for a brief period of time, after being exposed to certain visual information, we have access to it. And that period of time is quite brief. Well, it is a second, according to Sperling, because depending on how long the delay is between the tone and the offset of the display, so the gap between the moment the letters disappear from view and the moment you tell people to either go for the top or the middle or the bottom row, will determine how much of a benefit they have from this cue. If the cue comes immediately, they have the full benefit, and they will have access to about 9 letters, but once the delay of the tone has been increased to a second, the partial report benefit is gone, and people are back to this baseline performance of about 4 items. So that suggested that we have an iconic memory store in which we can store visual information that we've seen in a passive way. We don't need to make any effort to keep the information there, but if we want to use it, we have to get to it quickly because it's gone in about a second. Now, Anne Treisman, this is the same Treisman we saw before when we looked at feature integration theory, showed a similar effect in audition, which is called echoic memory. And echoic memory is the finding that if you give people a dichotic listening task, so a task where they get 2 streams of information, one in the left ear and one in the right ear, and they're asked to shadow one of them, so pay attention to one of the streams and ignore the other stream, and shadowing simply means reporting it back, so just repeating what you hear in one ear. What Treisman did was she manipulated what happened in the ignored ear, so what happened in the message that was presented to the ear that was being ignored at that time, and made the message in that channel sometimes identical to the attended message. And the question was, are people aware of that? So do they notice that something that they're attending to now has just happened before in the ear that they are ignoring? And the answer is they were not aware of this unless the repetition occurred within 2 seconds. So if you get something that happens less than 2 seconds from each other in both the attended and the ignored channel, you are aware of that. So that suggested that we have an echoic memory store that lasts about 2 seconds. So just like in vision, we automatically and passively retain information in our sensory store, in this case auditory information, and for auditory information it lasts for about 2 seconds. So those are the sensory stores, and loss of information simply comes from decay, so the information is simply lost over time and fairly quickly. Now, when we attend to the information that goes into the sensory stores, it may be transposed to the short-term store, and the short-term store holds information for a longer period of time, up to 20 seconds was the first idea, without rehearsal. If you rehearse information, it may be retained there for much longer, and it may even be transposed to the long-term store, but without rehearsal it would last for about 20 seconds. So the short-term memory store in the multi-store model of memory is the next stage through which information flows as it is maintained in memory. In order for information to be encoded in short-term memory, we need to attend to it, so anything in the sensory store that's not attended to is unlikely to end up in short-term memory, and storage in short-term memory is an active process, so you need to rehearse information in order to keep it there, and if you don't, information will be lost, and sufficient rehearsal in the short-term store will lead to transfer of information to the long-term memory store. Now, the span or the capacity of the short-term store is limited. Early evidence suggested that we can hold about 7 plus or minus 2 items, so some people have large spans up to 9 items, some people have small spans about 5 items, on average about 7, and that means we can hold on average 7 pieces of information. And a piece of information is a bit of a flexible term, because it can be, for example, digits or letters, if you just ask people to remember digits or letters or words, and people can chunk together different pieces of information so that they use only one slot in their short-term memory, and that's called chunking. and chunking is a way to kind of exceed this strict limit in terms of capacity. So for example, if you would ask people on the street to remember a sequence of letters, and you gave them the letters N, P, T, N, Y, U, K, L, the NYU to them would use up 3 slots, because those 3 letters are not one meaningful unit for them. But for us, because we know NYU, NYU might just take up a single slot. So what is a unit of information is a flexible term, and you can chunk different bits of information into a single unit, which effectively expands the span of short-term memory. So without rehearsal, information will decay, just like in the sensory store, and once the amount of information in short-term memory exceeds the capacity of short-term memory, information will be displaced. So the information that's in there is kind of pushed out by new information entering the system. And one key piece of evidence for this idea that we have different stores to maintain short-term versus longer-term information comes from serial position curves in free recall. And serial position curves we'll see that in a minute, are a way of plotting how well information is maintained as a function of when it was encoded. So let's have a look at those. So first of all, here we're looking at the way we forget information over the short term. So we have on the x-axis time in seconds up to about 18 seconds, and on the y-axis the success of recall. And you can see that after about 3 seconds people's recall is pretty good, so they recall almost everything that they learned. So here, for example, people had to remember a set of digits or a set of letters, and 3 seconds after learning they will know almost all of them again, but that remembering rate falls off quickly until after about 20 seconds it's all lost. And the key assumption is that people don't rehearse the information. Once they rehearse the information, they can keep it in their system almost indefinitely, and it may be transferred to their long-term store. But without rehearsal, it will be lost after about 20 seconds. So here we have the probability of correctly remembering the information that has been learned. So this is effectively the same variable as on the x-axis in the previous graph, but now these are the items that came earliest in learning. So the serial position of this item meant that it was the first item that people learned when they learned them, and this was the last item they learned. So this is in a way the most recent item, and this is the least recent item. And we have 3 conditions. Either we ask people immediately after they've learned the information, or after a 10-second delay, or after a 30-second delay. Now first of all, we find that we just saw in the previous graph, which is this fall off here, which is that if you ask people immediately, you will see that they will remember things that they've just learned best. So the information that they've just learned is remembered best. Now you don't get this benefit if you wait 10 seconds or 30 seconds after people have learned the information. So you have to ask them immediately. If you ask them immediately what they've committed to short-term memory, then those recent items have a real benefit. They are remembered really well. So we call this a recency effect. So the recency effect is to find that items that were encountered last in the sequence of learning are remembered relatively well. So that makes sense, but then we also have this effect here, which is on the surface harder to explain. So here we find that items that were encountered early on in learning, so items that are encountered longest ago in the context of learning these items, are remembered really well, and that happens in each of those 3 conditions. So regardless of whether you ask people immediately after learning or after a 30-second wait, you find that the items that they encountered first when they were learning are remembered much better than items that are encountered later on. This is called the primacy effect. So the primacy effect is the finding that items that occur early in a list of learning are remembered well. And the primacy effect is explained in terms of the multi-store model of memory by assuming that these items get a relatively good deal because they enter an empty short-term memory store. So this first item here goes into a short-term memory store that isn't full of other items yet. So this item has a relatively good chance of being rehearsed, and as a result of that being transposed to long-term memory. The second item also has a good chance of that, a bit less good than the first one, because this one now has to compete with that one, because the first item will still be in there, etc. And as you get to about 7 items, which is when your short-term memory is full up, the next item is actually gets quite a poor deal, because it has to compete with an already full short-term memory store. So these primacy effects are usually explained by saying, well, this is evidence for the working of long-term memory. So these items come out of long-term memory, whereas these items come out of short-term memory. And that kind of distinction between recency and primacy effects is seen as a key piece of evidence for this multi-store model of memory. For this idea that we have separate stores for short-term and long-term information. So once information enters the long-term memory store through rehearsal in short-term memory, it's encoded, and encoding in long-term memory happens very much by meaning. So long-term memory really likes information to make sense. It doesn't really care about what the information looks like or sounds like or feels like. So the surface characteristics are lost, but information that makes sense, that has meaning to the long-term memory system, has a much better chance of being maintained than information that's meaningless. And there's good evidence that being able to link different pieces of information in terms of their meaning will really increase the chance of them being maintained in long-term memory. So storage in long-term memory relies on a process called consolidation, and consolidation is the fixing of information in long-term memory. And the idea is that a key structure that's important for that is the hippocampus and the amygdala. And there's no evidence that there is a limit to the capacity of our long-term memory system. So the information ends up being distributed across the neocortex, and there's evidence that, for example, visual long-term memories are more likely to be stored close to visual processing areas, and long-term memories that have more of an auditory signature are likely to be stored close to auditory cortex. Now, of course, we do forget information from the long-term store, so we lose information, but the evidence seems to suggest that that's very often a retrieval issue. So it's not the case that the information is actually lost from the system, but it's just that we from time to time have difficulty finding it back. And some of the more anecdotal evidence for this idea that retrieval is an important driver of failures in long-term memory are the fact that often these failures are temporary. So if I can think of somebody who I know, and I can imagine their face quite well, but I just can't get their name right now, if I forget about it and revisit that memory problem this evening, I might be able to remember that person's name. Now, it's not the case that I kind of re-enter that information into my system between now and this evening, but it's clearly there right now, even though I'm failing to remember it. So the only way to explain that kind of failure of memory is to say, well, the information is there, but it's difficult to retrieve it at this moment. The tip of the tongue phenomenon is another example of that. So this idea that you sometimes know exactly what you're trying to remember, but you just can't quite get there. So again, it seems to be that the information is in the system but can't be retrieved. And a factor that has been shown in the lab often to help long-term memory is the use of retrieval cues. So often it is the case that if you give people some help in trying to remember something, they will remember it much better than without that help. So you don't give them the full answer, but you say, for example, you're looking for an answer that starts with the letter B, and if that helps them find the word that they're looking for, again, it has to be the case that the word was in their system still, they hadn't lost it, but they just couldn't find it back, and just getting some kind of cue, some kind of hint at where to look for it might really aid long-term memory.